Lab. My name is Florian Mueller from the Exertion Games Lab. Together we're presenting you movement-based game guidelines. We start off with a little quick overview and explaining you why we're interested and excited about designing movement-based games. Then the main contribution of this work is the development of 10 guidelines for these games, and then we're going to show you how we validated these guidelines with an all-star cast of experts.
So first of all, talking about motivation, maybe we don't have to motivate too hard because the whole session is about this stuff, but it shows that it's a growing area of game design, both in terms of mainstream console game development, but also in the indie scene, and it's certainly an interesting site for research about movement and interaction between people as well. So this is an example of a game out of my lab. It's called Yeah Move, and I gave a keynote about it at Mobile HCI in 2012. It was also an IndieCade finalist that year.
Games that we tried out at Interactivity at CHI, and then we developed some design cards that you're actually going to see in the talk after next.
Yeah, so you can see we've had a lot of experience in this area. So you might say to yourself, well, there's already a lot of published work on game design, and there are certainly some excellent texts that are useful both to researchers and to practitioners. But what we noticed is there isn't necessarily so much material, at least facing practitioners, people who build games, whether they're commercial developers or indie developers out there in the world. Which is not to say that there hasn't been a lot of peer-reviewed publication of game experimentation in the research community. And we've written some of these papers. There's people in the audience who've written really, really excellent papers. The thing about our academic papers, even when they often have recommendations for design, they don't necessarily always, make their way all in exploring that and trying to figure out a way to get ourselves further out there. So, the first step of our process was for the two of us to join forces because we've both been working in this area for a long time. And each of us spent a lot of time thinking and pondering about our own practice and talking with our fellow practitioners in our labs and the students that we teach. And then, of course, we did some arm wrestling about which things are important and which not, because we have different kinds of practices. But really, we didn't do arm wrestling. We were very civilized in our discussion. But in any case, after doing this, really for about at least a year, Floyd came and visited my lab, and he held a workshop for my students. We did a lot of collaboration and discussion. We came up with a set of 10, what we were then calling heuristics, out of that practice. And truthfully, they were a little bit dry and still pretty researchy. So Floyd will talk about what happened next.
So we showed them to our designers in our respective labs, and there's a couple of key insights that came out of that. One thing is the designers hated the word heuristics, even though as academics we use it all the time. They hated that. They said we don't know what that is. And structure. They wanted more structure, which we as academics of course like. They wanted to know what they should do, but also what they shouldn't do, which we thought very interesting. And they wanted more examples. Even though we provided examples, they wanted more. So overall, they really liked the content, but they hated the presentation. So we thought we can fix that, and therefore we developed a website where we provided the structure, called them guidelines from now on, provided more examples. And before we go into the details of one specific guideline, I thought I'm just going to present you now with the overall structure to give you a feel. So if we look to the left, you will see all these 10 guidelines. They're all online, so therefore I'm just going to focus for you on the 3 key structural elements. So first one is movement requires special feedback. Very important for designers to consider. Movement leads to bodily challenges, because our bodies have opportunities but also challenges that you can exploit in your design. And movement emphasizes certain kind of fun, in particular in contrast to mouse and keyboard games. So let's focus on embrace ambiguity. First of all, that's our first.
Ambiguity in the last paper.
Okay, but that's fine. Each guideline starts off with a hopefully catchy sentence. This one here is, instead of fighting the ambiguity of movement, embrace it. Detail about it, often in the form of explanation why we think that guideline is important. Here, number 1 is no two movements are the same. And most sensor data is messy. And then we provide an example. Here the example is Kinect Adventures, the game that came out with the original Kinect. And you're lucky because we're not just going to show you the example, we're actually going to act it out for you. Because we want to make you think about how, so the designers told us about the design process. We realized how much they embraced ambiguity in their design. But therefore, we're going to play out this game now, and you tell designers embraced ambiguity there.
So we
okay?
In the front, right?
Yes.
Around.
So we've got our outfit.
I'm trying to wake you guys up in the morning, you know?
All right. Connect Adventure works. You are steering a raft through an obstacle course. Right? We've got two players.
You're the lead.
I'm going to be in front, and we both have to balance onto the.
You turned off the sound. I'm all by myself. Why?
There you go. That's as loud as it gets. All right. I'll be louder for that. So you have to steer here. You have to get the point. Left, forward, left, and then you get these extra points. And then left again. Down and then over these, and that's it, all right? That's the game. Thank you very much. So that's the game. What when you think about now is how the designers embrace ambiguity here, right? And we believe they actually engaged with these two strategies, even though they didn't know it at the time. So strategy one is to construct the player's actions in a way that gives room for sensor error without drawing attention to it. And here what I thought they did really brilliantly is me going left, for example. Right? I was going left and it kind of got an error there. If it would have just been me on the raft, I would have blamed the sensor, of course. But because they placed both of us into the raft, and I go left and my avatar doesn't go left, I go, what's going on? Katherine, it's your fault. Right? And for me, it makes sense, this ambiguity. Because there's another player involved steering the same raft.
That's right. Blame it on your friend instead of the system.
Exactly. Good strategy. Second one is what we think they did really well. They avoided game mechanisms that require precise control. Right? Remember, we were in a raft, which is already very wobbly. And then you've got the water around with the current. So if you both go left and the raft doesn't go left, well, it could just be because of the current going around us.
And you notice you don't have paddles and you don't have a rudder, so they avoided anything that would give the illusion of precise control because they weren't able to deliver.
Yeah, and we thought it was really clever. In contrast to, for example, a car racing game, right, where I would expect very precise control. If we are in a raft, on water, without rudders, we wouldn't expect that precise control, and that's how they really nicely embrace this ambiguity of these sensor errors. So they did. Remember when we talked about the guidelines, we also told designers what they should and shouldn't do. So here we continue with this now, and we tell designers that they do use the ambiguity of sensor data to enhance the game. They should do that. What they shouldn't do, is to not use buttons during the development phase. Even though it might sound tempting, because you think you can save time, don't do that.
Yeah, so don't try to simulate messy movement with precise button control, because you won't be able to improve. Okay, so that's just one of our guidelines. You can see the rest online. I want to talk a little bit about the experts we recruited. So we were really lucky because we had a long experience in this area. We could recruit 14 people who had really great experience across these different areas. So first of all, industry people from many of the major console developers who worked on some of the games you may have played in your living room. And then indie practitioners who've hosted festivals and shown games in many venues. And then also people from our own research community. So in terms of industry, we were able to get people like the design lead for Dance Central, one of the user research leads at Ubisoft who's worked on products like Your Shape, research for the Sony iToy, which is one of the first pieces of equipment in this space. On the indie side, we were able to get people who not only built these kinds of games, but also curated festivals where a lot of these games took place. They could reflect on that experience as well. Things like Come Out and Play, which happens in New York every year, and Indie Katie's, which is also in New York. And then in academia, we found people similarly who had a practice of making these kinds of games, but also curated things like the WOOT Festival and the Game Jam here at CHI. So what did they say?
So there were a couple of key themes that we want to highlight. One is they said it mirrored their experience. They mirrored their experience of playtesting, of observing players, our approach. What they also said was that it provided them a language. They often said, we knew kind of what was wrong with the game, but I had a really hard time to articulating that to my team and to my managers. So they were really thankful for now having a language to articulate their design choices and desires. And they also wanted to use the guidelines and the checklist for mentoring their staff, in particular junior staff or their students, which we welcomed.
And just a side note, one interesting that came out of this was after I worked with the experts at one company, they turned around and decided to write a journal article about their own work in evolving how to design for this space, and they referenced our paper and asked us for literature review. So it actually created this interesting feedback loop on the publishing side between industry and academia.
Which was very nice.
Yeah.
So we took all this feedback into account and present you now the movementguidelines.org. That website is live for you to use. Please use it with your students. If you have any other additional comments for us to improve upon.
Yep. And one thing we already know that we want to improve is actually, we showed you here, since we're all here together, we could physically show you something and let you understand and experience it. Even better would have been if you guys would have gotten up here and tried it out for yourself. So one of the pieces of feedback we got was, well, it'd be great to actually be able to show or rehearse or engage these things directly as a mentoring way to teach these guidelines. So we're working on figuring out games we could put up on the website that can be unpacked to be physical experiences for people to have, and maybe videos as well of movement play and movement interaction that would help surface and reveal some of the stuff at a kinesthetic level for people. So in close, the takeaway messages, one is please make use of the website. The whole point of this was to create a useful resource for practical design and share it with people you think might benefit from it. But for those of you who don't actually design movement-based games, one thing we think is a good takeaway from this process for us was engaging experts, practice experts in the formulation of the message of the material. So in other words, instead of us creating a taxonomy and presenting a paper and publishing that paper, bringing those people who do practice into the process to let them help shape the language and help shape how the material is delivered and how it's set up. We think that could be of great value to anyone who's very interested in taking the kinds of theory and structures we generate in this community all the way out into the practitioner world where people don't always have time to read our articles and may not understand things the same way that we do.
Yeah, and that was our talk on movement-based game guidelines. Again, go to the website, make use of that, use it with your students, with your staff. This is Katherine Isbister. My name is Floyd Mueller. Thank you very much.
We've got lots of time for Q&A.
Good.
So I've got a question about, sorry, Joe Marshall, University of London. I've got a question about your thing about the imprecise nature of kind of sensor control. So I saw a guy from there talking about the work he'd done on Connect 4 rivals, and it's fascinating how little of that stuff they have to do now in the Connect 2.
Yes. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about increasing quality of this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome point. I mean, you can even see from the work in the first paper that the move controller is much more precise, right? So it's a continuum. I mean, you can't just tie to specific technologies. You have to think about each one as it comes, how much precision is available with those sensors, what's the slop factor, how difficult is it? You know, with vision, it's recognizing gestures, and it's also coming up with a gesture vocabulary that people can exercise where they don't accidentally trip things. So there are many embedded subtleties in working with ambiguity, but our point was just, especially when these consoles first came out, many game designers were applying button press, game press. No, we need to begin from the sensor capacity, right?
And I also can quickly add, maybe talk to Jaden afterwards, because he's got a couple of ideas where he talks about that ambiguity. Even if you have a Kinect 3 and it detects everything really well, you've got players who run out of the room to hide from the sensor, right? That's another ambiguity. And then you can put another sensor in that room and then run out of the street. So you can, you find more opportunities to exploit that ambiguity.
Hi, again, I'm from Aalto University of Finland. So I was continuing on Joe's comment. So what I have done missing is counter examples.
Sorry, go on.
Counter examples.
Counter examples. So
Yeah.
you have examples, but there's also counter examples. I was thinking about the ambiguity as well. There's some researchers who have really pushed the precision and control.
Sure.
Like myself, I must say, I've been trying to do that, and some less succeeded. So, but I don't know, maybe in the other guidelines also there could be some counter examples.
I think that also has to do with what you're trying to accomplish. So we as researchers, we're often pushing the envelope and trying to really make something do everything we could possibly want it to do. And that's also true of game developers, but on the other hand, they have the realities of each platform. If you're an indie, you have the reality. And so there's more of an emphasis on the end experience for the player. How can I perfectly sculpt an awesome play experience that doesn't break down? And so it's kind of a tension, right? And it's like, that was one of the things that came up in forming these guidelines. Like, you think differently as a researcher than you do as somebody who's trying to get a game out on a deadline, right? And we were trying to address more of that continuum.
I mean, we did have counterexamples, and we realized that's what we did during the arm wrestling. Because, telling each other that, yeah, but you didn't follow that guideline in your game.
Yes.
No, but you didn't follow this one. Oh, I did. This was then the conversation that you realize that you broke them yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's how it all started, that iterative conversation out of that.
That's very true.
I've just got one more point, which is, do you link into game reviews? Because if you look at the early Connect games, a lot of this stuff will come out in reviews.
Yeah, that's an awesome data project to do. I mean, we didn't systematically go through reviews, but I think that would be a great way to surface issues. And certainly, that's the player conversation was happening around the first release of, oh, I like this, but I don't like that. And I know that the game companies pay a lot of attention to that in tweaking what they're doing.
And I remember, Katherine, one of the first emails she sent me was actually a review of the game, and say, like, can you believe that they did all this wrong? And you kind of go, it was let's not name names, but a company with money that has expertise, and you think they would get that right, or it's kind of at least a little bit right, and the review just slashed them. So that always started that conversation about maybe they need something to help them develop these games.
Yeah, and we were only able to go into one principle, so we definitely encourage you to look at the others, because each one of them has the same structure and a lot of detail. One more.
Alexander Ball from the Queensland University of Technology. I was just wondering, with the point you raised, raising the ambiguity of it, and avoiding this very precise control where it becomes apparent when the sensor doesn't exactly match up with what's happening. Do you see it as a better way to do it, of not necessarily having a player's avatar on the screen directly replicating their movements, instead of doing something abstracted or even a pre-canned animation? So using Dance Central as an example, it's not actually copying the player's movement, it's just reading. Is the player doing a interpretation of what the game is showing them to do? Compared to something like Connect Adventures, where it's trying to actually show when you raise your hand, it tries to copy the exact movement.
I can tell the Dance Central people gave a wonderful talk at the Game Developer Conference specifically about decisions they made in prototyping. And part of the reason they removed precise replication of the person is because people really hated seeing themselves in the game. So they, the Kinect even had the ability to do the video overlay, and they thought at first that would be really fun, and realized people wanted to see an idealized model doing the move perfectly. They didn't want to see their own mistakes reflected back to them in that way as they were trying to dance. They became self-conscious. So I think they had one reason for doing it, but I completely agree with you that there are all kinds of interesting cheats about training people in the system and the sorts of feedback you give that can help shape their expectations of fidelity. And they may read much more fidelity into the system than is really there if you make some of those decisions as students.
And that wasn't the case for kids.
Yeah, kids like the video. Like there's a game by Tim Schafer called Happy Action Theater for the Kinect. It's really great, where you just wander around in this kind of augmented video space, like bursting into flame and kicking snow around, and your video is in there sort of like Godzilla, and it's super playful and fun, and as Gloria was saying, kids like that. So you have to look at demographics as well.
What's that game called again?
Wait, Happy Action Theater?
Yeah.
It's the absolute best Kinect game I've ever played.
Happy Action Theater, really easy to remember. And it looks like a happy theater. That's really from the start. It's like, it makes me happy. It's great.
So thanks.
Thank you, Rob.